everyone, it's Alex, and this weekend on Sunday I turn 27. And I know with this past year, I know if anything it's proven that time isn't real, but I figured what I wanted to do is that thinking about it with my reading life as I get older, that I've really had a lot of accumulating years in which I've read some really distinct books that I think have really affected my reading life. So looking back as early as 2015, I wanted to try to find 27 books, since I'm turning 27, that I would consider the most influential. So starting off with 2015, the first book I want to talk about is The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. 2015 in general was a year in which it was really when I first started reading. So with the books I plan to mention for this year, they were all ones that really sort of awakened in me that one, they were books I liked, but two, I really didn't consider reading as like a thing that people did actively as like a hobby, which I know sounds weird to say, but I figured reading was such an isolated event where maybe someone only read maybe like during vacation or whenever they had like a clear break during the year or something. It never really occurred to me that with reading it's like this very active experience of being a part of the bookish world. Like when I walk into a bookstore, and then initially I'd always thought that books were only there because they were either like bestsellers for years or they were maybe just books that people needed for school. And with The Year of Magical Thinking specifically, it was one, a work of nonfiction I'd read, but with the way in which Didion, just her very observant nature, which sort of made me binge all of her other nonfiction work. The Year of Magical Thinking tells the story of how Didion coped with the loss of her husband, but it was within quick succession, or at least very close within the time of also losing her daughter. So that sense of grief, but also its way to channel it through writing, was something really profound and effective to me. Something as effective as what I usually, with fiction through other mediums, like video games for example, was something I thought could only be displayed with some at least sort of visual impact on me. But it really made me start to suspect that reading was something where I could have this same feeling of reading something as, I might say, generally as like an art form. Speaking of form, the next book I want to mention is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. Naturally, me working through a backlist of a bunch of books that I thought were supposedly good, maybe like winning prizes and stuff, I wanted to pick this one up because it sounded really interesting with, to me when I read it, feeling sort of like short stories mixed into one world. Egan takes some liberties with form here. I think there's even one formatting in here that's very similar to a PowerPoint. But this book really had a good impression on me on feeling like a very well executed work in which it was fiction, but it really had this signature of a sense of a writer feeling like I was reading something very unique. And my initial impression of authors is that they always wrote very maybe easy and linear to understand works, or probably in my brain back then, probably thinking more so of just regular commercial fiction, which obviously there's nothing wrong with commercial fiction, but that was just my impression of why people read in the first place. So with A Visit from the Goon Squad, it not only satisfied my brain in reading about these characters, but also how they overlapped with a sense of storytelling. I have a couple more for 2015, and one of them is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I'm sure Donna Tartt doesn't need an introduction for many of you, but with The Secret History, it was actually a big portion of my beginning reading life is due to my friend Kelsey, who I've talked about on this channel before and who was in my anti-TBR video. But Kelsey and I used to live together, which was a great time, and she was always reading, which always made me very curious, and she told me about books like The Secret History. So I read it, and it was the first light bulb in me where I realized I could read about young people, but without it being YA. Again, knocking down my impressions of my assumptions of reading and how there are books out there about young people that isn't about them always like falling in love in high school or whatever, and there's nothing wrong with those stories. I just felt like I'd outgrown them by then in 2015. But The Secret History, it's like a great little, it's like definitely a great book for people wanting to get into reading, I would say, like what it did for me. Has great characters, very clever execution with the story, and Donna Tartt, I think it's between like me only reading that one and The Goldfinch, I much prefer The Secret History. And finally for 2015, which I've mentioned a ton on this channel, is A Little Life by Hanya Yangihara. I won't hold you all hostage by talking about this book because I've talked about it so many times, but this was like the first book I'm still chasing that feeling of reading something like this that really, truthfully, is probably what made me want to read more or decide I want to be a reader, because I want to find more stories like this. A Little Life is about 4 friends living in New York, and that's pretty much all I'll say. But I just really loved the very humdrum nature of just getting to know these characters, and that feeling again of just feeling really affected by reading, which really surprised me. Like many people, I definitely was a victim of crying because of this book, which is again something I feel like I'm really good about, understanding the difference between this is fiction and I'm not really like emotional towards fictional stuff like movies or books or whatever else. But for some reason this one really got me. So again, it's just a book I have to give thanks to because it's really what instilled in me trying to find more books like it. So now moving on to 2016, which I'll say 2016 and 2017 are definitely years where I tried finding out more about what specifically would spark my interest in reading more, and also a good combination of like backlist stuff. But the first book I want to mention is The Liars Club by Mary Karr, which is a memoir. It is also probably the best memoir I've read just because Mary Karr does a great job at weaving in her real life feeling much like fiction. The Liars Club is concerned with her growing up in Texas, and she actually has like an installment of memoirs. So her second one is Cherry and her third one is Lit, all following different areas and phases of her life. But The Liars Club to me is really unmatched, so if you haven't read it as a memoir fan or a nonfiction fan, I would definitely pick it up if you haven't already. Up next I have How to Be Both by Ali Smith, which is really what started it all with my Ali Smith binge. I personally really loved the reading experience of How to Be Both because it was super hard. I definitely had to read it a second time shortly after reading it the first time, but it was so playful and unlike anything I'd read before, and I really appreciated that, and just that general tone of playfulness at the same time of that sincerity of really trying to challenge me as a reader. I think a contemporary version of this feeling to me as a more recent book would be something like Milkman by Anna Burns. But yeah, that's really what started it all with Ali Smith for me. And I still think it's her most challenging book I've read, but I'm really glad I started there. Up next I have Raise High, The Roofbeam, Carpenters, and Seymour, an Introduction by J.D. Salinger. This is a super underrated one in my opinion. I really like J.D. Salinger. I read like all of his stuff within the beginning years of my reading life. But this installment of his work is twofold. So the first half is about sort of this novella about attending a wedding, and then the second half is this very long stream of consciousness novella where a person has lost their relative, so he's died recently. And I really loved how Salinger wrote about this very sentimental feeling that felt a lot more mature to me versus something like Catcher in the Rye, which I also like. But the reason this makes it on my most influential list is because I really felt, again, that sincerity of what really tugs at you whenever you read a work by Salinger with all of his works. There's always this lingering melancholy, and I think with this book, it really has a great combination of that storytelling and some funny, humorous moments, especially in the beginning novella part. So yeah, super underrated, and honestly, like maybe a little pretentious, but I really liked it. Up next, I have Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, and this is really when I was starting to feel like I was behind on classics. And Lolita really surprised me because I liked it a lot more than I thought I would, mainly because I think it's a great study of this horrible person, and also just at a linguistic level of how Nabokov was able to write this very sensational sense of language that was so rooted in this main character's head. I also feel like not enough people talk about how funny Lolita is with like some plot elements that I won't spoil, but it does involve a car, and that's all I'll say. And the last one for 2016 is The One in a Million Boy by Monica Wood, which was awful. This is a good reminder for me that influential doesn't always mean good. In 2016, I was still doing that thing where I'd walk into a bookstore and I didn't know what book I wanted, which is never the case now whenever I like intentionally pick what I'm reading next. So by just browsing the shelves, I felt so defeated because I didn't know what I was doing or what I was looking for, which is really what I think for a lot of people getting into reading is the worst part. If, like me, doing the mistake of picking a book like this, which was so kitschy, about like a child visiting this like 100-year-old woman who's confessing about her life, which feels so commercial to me, which is what I was not looking for. So yeah, shout out to this book because I didn't like it. So for 2017, I actually only have two here. and one of them is The Lonely City by Olivia Laing. Actually, with both of these books, I read them right in the beginning, like literally the first week of January, I think, of 2017. And with The Lonely City, and the second book, which I guess I'll go ahead and mention, which is Stoner by John Williams. In this part of my life, I would say my reading was much more affected by my personal life. So around this time, I was in my first semester of grad school, so I felt a little, isolated within academia and definitely feeling all of that imposter syndrome. So reading The Lonely City, which is so funny because me in my small town in West Virginia visiting the local Starbucks and like studying in there for hours for school stuff and me thinking I was like the main character. I would take breaks by reading The Lonely City and I found a lot of solace in it, not only because of Olivia Laing's sense of describing the loneliness of her sense of channeling it through her appreciation of art, but also again that sentiment of how she looks at like art in her life as a reflection of who she is within that time, which I really appreciate. And literally what I just said being that I was feeling like I was doing the same with the books I was reading being instances of being mirrors to how I was feeling at the time. And then with Stoner by John Williams, that one's a classic pick because it's also about this man in academia, and it was really one of the first books I read that was so intentionally bland. Literally just following this man living his life through academia and then thoughts on like war and then marriage and whatever else. And it was so painfully ordinary and I loved it. Similar to A Little Life, but not quite at the A Little Life level. Stoner was a book that really made me want to find more stories like that, that really tried to document that sense of the ordinary, so that's something I always appreciate in books. Up next we have 2018, which honestly, I don't know if anyone else does this, but I'm so nostalgic for this reading year because it was definitely by far the best reading year I've ever had in my life so far. We have The Idiot by Elif Batuman, which is a true classic of like what I didn't think was possible of being this book about I don't even think Celine, who's our main character, is even in her 20s. I think she's 19. But Batuman writes Celine as being this very capable young girl going to Harvard as a young Turkish American. But also she's discovering email and having unrequited crushes with her classmates, which I really vibe with. So smart and clever and wonderfully written and super funny too. I really loved this book and I'm really excited because I think Elif Batuman is writing a sequel to The Idiot eventually. As no surprise to anyone, my next one, or at least one I have to mention, is the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante. I'm considering all 4 books as just one book, so no one yell at me. Truly unmatched. There's nothing like the Neapolitan novels out in the world, and maybe there never will be. In case you don't know, this is a series that follows a young girl named Elena and her best friend Lila. Within the backdrop of Naples, Italy, there's a bunch of stuff about the times and like unrequited love and a sense of place and belonging and yearning and opportunity, and it's so wonderful. I just really, like, if anything with my reading life, I think what is a series I'll remember like years from now, it will probably always be this series. I now have a contribution to short stories, so any short story fans out there, I wanted to mention The Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. Probably the best short story collection I've read, or at least the one I mostly recommend to people, but this is about primarily a lot of characters navigating the immigrant experience specifically in relation to the United States. Lahiri manages to cover a lot of ground very effortlessly, and it has this very humane and brilliant sense of detail with her characters' desires and their way of navigating the world. So I really love this. Again, kind of mentioning another dud is The Female Persuasion by Meg Wolitzer. This is the book I think of whenever I really think about at the same time within this year. It was within my first year of doing BookTube. And I remember this as being one of the more buzzy books I was getting myself into. And I'd read Meg Wolitzer before with The Interestings, which I thought was fine. But The Female Persuasion felt so pandery. Is that a word? It at least pandered, I thought, to like the growing sort of discourse or public discourse on feminism and intersectionality and all that stuff, and I just wasn't really buying it. The Female Persuasion in itself, in like the world of the book Female Persuasion, I think is like this book or like a manifesto made by this woman that's meant to be like so great, and it really affects this one girl who's a student in college. And this girl in college is written to be this very like main character energy, if you know what I'm talking about, where she's like this prodigy and being like the next thing, or like the next big influencer of feminism. And I don't know, it just really rubbed me the wrong way, and it felt really one note, and I thought like it wasn't very good. Up next I have The Waves by Virginia Woolf. So 2018 was my year of Virginia Woolf, so I had a great time discovering her, and my favorite book by far by her is The Waves. The Waves is about a group of friends throughout the years, and then unfortunately one of them does pass away, and it's about how all of these friends come together and really reflect on that sense of memory of who their friend was. Absolutely brilliant, and I think like leagues ahead of things like Mrs. Dalloway. But Mrs. Dalloway is also good. So I think it's really a matter of like, this is a weird reference, but think of like Pokemon and think of like the starter you choose, and that feels a lot like reading a Virginia Woolf book. Up next I have Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. With my relationship of like nature and stuff, it's pretty limited, but growing up in West Virginia here in the United States, I felt like this really great kinship with reading Dillard and her reflections in general with like setting and place and nature. In Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, she primarily talks about a lot of the backdrop of Virginia, so kind of my neighboring area. But Dillard's sense of enthusiasm with her writing is so much fun. There's like one part in here that I really loved where she's talking to this man, I think maybe at a gas station, and Dillard is telling him about like something really specific, I think about a fish, and the man is being polite and like just laughing to be nice, and Dillard says something like, "Why was he laughing? I'm trying to change his life." And finally for 2018 I have Outline by Rachel Cusk. Again, kind of in that vibe of maybe books like Stoner by John Williams. Outline to me was another revelation of sorts of being a novel that really tried to, I think, crack at sort of the very humane qualities of what it means to be a person and being secure in your personhood. The book itself covers 10 conversations that truthfully outline the sense of our main narrator, whose name is Faye. And we never really get to know a lot about Faye. Her reflections of how she feels is based on her participation, or maybe lack thereof, and these people naturally are pretty much giving their own little like soliloquies on life based on what their conversations are about. But yeah, I really love this one, and that does it for 2018. So again, a lot to contribute from this year, but I really loved all these books, and it was a great reading year for me. For 2019, I would say this is definitely my year of classics. Two notable ones I have here, of course, is Pride and Prejudice and also Middlemarch. Jane Austen is unmatched in being so clever, and it feels like a crime to not realize it so much earlier in my reading life, but I really loved binge reading Jane Austen and starting with Pride and Prejudice to really ignite in me discovering and really like reading more of her work more deeply. And as for Middlemarch being my favorite book of 2019, with Pride and Prejudice a close second, again really reinforcing that sense of this timelessness of even back then with George Eliot writing this epic of human wonder about what it just means to live your life within this backdrop of these characters that clash and intercept each other's lives and really try to prod and poke at the mystery of life, so to speak. With more specifics, with my next one here for 2019 being A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood, I wanted to shout this one out because I know, of course, with the canon of literature involving gay literature, some might consider A Single Man a modern classic with this contributing sort of area of literature, and I would definitely agree. I think A Single Man greatly within its scope because it's not very long. It really describes the tragedy and like angst and pain and grief of what it means to love someone. Not even loving someone that happens to be the same sex as you, but just the general, like it's sort of incidental about who we love, and it feels like we're always at the mercy of love in itself as a feeling. Isherwood, of course, masterfully also describes the setting of our main character also being a teacher in California. I think this is set in the 60s too. So of course there's that public sort of presence of what it means to really show who you are whenever you can't within the times. And speaking of years in time, I wanted to mention The Years by Annie Ernaux. This is another nonfiction work, and I think it is the best book I've read on memory, as Ernaux herself recounts her life, and it feels like this historical document of like events within the time period she describes, and then also cementing her life in there. Not that Erno considers her personal life to be like a historical event, but she doesn't dispute the importance of being conscious to how your life is affected by how the world shapes you. And in regard to how the world might shape a person, I also wanted to mention Know My Name by Chanel Miller. Again, another nonfiction work, as Chanel Miller reveals more detail within her famous impact statement of whenever she was anonymously, I think anonymously she was named Emily Doe, and she talks about the case she's famously known for about being assaulted by a Stanford student, Brock Turner. Just the power of how this was so public, like in the world, and how Chanel Miller had no real direct control over that. Like, her writing is incredible within this memoir, and having her to relive it not only through a sense of writing, but her sequencing of talking about the process of the justice system mingled with having to sort of talk about things like dissociation. I think she did a really great job, and I really commend her for detailing things like this in a way of also helping other victims, but also it being much more about, again, those talking points on the justice system. And finally, for 2019, I have On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. But I have mixed feelings about it, mainly like on a, like just a, like a reading level, like based on language. I thought it was like kind of overwritten and a bit too flowery for me. But on a personal level, just even me saying that, I really thought within 2019 I was beyond reading books that affected me personally, because I tried to look at them more critically from an objective view, which obviously is not a requirement for anyone reading. It's just my brain considering what's fun. So even if this book didn't work for me, about how Ocean Vuong details a young Vietnamese boy moving to America with his mother who can't speak or write in English or understand it, I was really moved by it, I have to say, based on, again, thinking of my own sense of my relationship with like the States and my mom also immigrating here. A lot of beats really hit home for me, so I really like it for that, but otherwise it didn't entirely land for me. So this book really taught me having to always be surprised by my own sense of how reading affects me. Now moving on to 2020, I only have 2 books to mention here, and they are the classic millennial variety. I have Exciting Times by Nisha Dolan and Lester by Raven Leilani. Again, similar to On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, I had assumed that the millennial discourse passed with Sally Rooney stuff, like back in 2016 or whatever with Conversations with Friends, and then I think it was 2018 when Normal People came out. It's really weird because I don't see Normal People as like a millennial book at all. I think Conversations with Friends is much more so, but with Exciting Times and Lester by Raven Leilani, they feel much more like what the intent of the millennial discourse is that people think about Sally Rooney. In particular, I just found the voices of Exciting Times and Lester to be really refreshing because they're so transparent without being like so self-deprecating or self-conscious. In Exciting Times, we have Ava, who's refreshingly saying things like, "How dare you read me so well because I know I'm an awful person and I'm trying to figure out ways on social media to like get to know you without actually talking to you." And in Lester, it's as easy as having someone like objectively point to relationships between art and one's race and their positioning and their privilege in America whenever trying to do things like just so happening to date someone that happens to be white. But overall being that both of these books really taught me to value and appreciate what it means to be a 20-something in this part of my life now. And less sentimentally when reading these 2 books, you know, during a pandemic and, you know, trying to date during a pandemic. Did I happen to project my dates onto feeling like the characters from Exciting Times and Lester? Maybe. And finally, I had to at least give one mention to 2021 so far. And it's not because I don't think this is like my favorite read of the year so far, but it's definitely up there. But I'm picking this one based on how I feel like it's in relation to, again, feeling how it's influential to me, and that's Fake Accounts by Lauren Euler. With the rise of internet discourse or the internet novel, and I say that by only ever thinking of also things like No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, which I also read this year. To me, Fake Accounts just does a really great job about illuminating the doom of internet potential, but also how it's serving as an archive of this self-reflection, which I think is nothing, or at least a component of the internet that initially none of us ever considered or thought could be possible. As our narrator in Fake Accounts makes us follow her through really pivotal life events like the Woman's March, and then also something as, you know, low stakes as going on a series of dates while also channeling zodiac signs. Really smart and fun and has some levity, although at the same time it feels critical, much like Lauren Euler's background of being a critic. I just really enjoyed this, and I know it won't be for everybody, which is totally fine, but I think it was really a great book at the right time for me. So yeah, those are 27 books at 27, or almost 27 at least whenever Sunday rolls around. I would really love to know your take on if you've read any of these books I mentioned, because I read so many books within my reading life in my 20s so far, and I'm sure I will read many more throughout the rest of my 20s. Similarly, I would also love to know about any books you consider to be the most influential and why. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.